Motherhood is the problem that modern feminists cannot face. She goes on to say that many contemporary feminists have reviled both mothers and babies. Some feminists rage at babies, others trivialize them. Very few have attempted to integrate them into the fabric of a full and equal life. Significantly, Laura Umansky, in her book Motherhood Reconceived, published in '96, positions her argument as a rebuttal to Hewlett's claim. This is what she says. Critics who accuse feminists of ignoring mothers or motherhood are not only wrong, but have completely missed the mark. She goes on to say that her book addresses what emerged between the late 1960s and early 1990s as a public, nationwide written feminist discussions about the meaning of motherhood. She argues that feminist discussions have subjected the institution of motherhood and the practice of mothering to their most complete, nuanced, and multifaceted analysis. She ends that section with this assertion. American feminists have long and vigorously debated the many issues that lie at the heart of motherhood. They may disagree over whether the bath is half empty or half full. They have most decidedly not thrown the baby out with the bathwater. As I read this book when it was first published in 1996, and I've read it many times, and though I find Umansky's argument persuasive, it did not reflect my own experience of being a motherhood scholar in the field of academic feminism, or the experiences of hundreds of motherhood scholars I have met over the last 2 decades as a motherhood researcher. This year, MIRCI celebrates its 20th anniversary and Demeter its 10th. In those years, as I've said, MIRCI has hosted 50 conferences, 38 journal issues have been published, and over 80 books. However, despite these many conferences hosted by our association and our journal and our books, not to mention the many other conferences and books on motherhood that have took place over the last 2 decades, I still hear, as I did 20 years ago at our first motherhood conference, stories from motherhood scholars about how their work has been ignored, dismissed, invalidated, or trivialized by academic feminists. I continue to hear how the women's studies conferences they attend have few, if any, papers on motherhood, how motherhood is seldom a topic of discussion in women's studies classrooms and rarely included in academic feminist textbooks, and how articles on motherhood or books on motherhood are still absent in the leading women's studies journals. How can we as mother academics reconcile the exclusion and isolation experienced by us as mother scholars with Umansky's claim that feminists have paid attention to motherhood? I think this disconnect between what Umansky is claiming and what actual mother scholars are experiencing is a result of different historical timeframes and their particular view of mothering, as well as the important distinction between feminist writing and the discipline of academic feminism. I agree with Umansky that from the mid-1970s to the early 80s, mothering was explored and indeed celebrated in much of feminist writing. But the theoretical perspective of this writing was specifically that of cultural difference feminism. A mode of feminism, and I won't go into it, but it was a feminism that honored women's difference. A mode of feminism, however, that by the 1990s, as one writer says, Kawash, that had been eclipsed and was no longer a serious topic of discussion in feminist graduate programs or in the academic feminist press. Thus, in the mid to late 90s, when motherhood studies came into being, the mode of feminist theory that would have been receptive to this new scholarship, that of difference in cultural feminism, had fallen out of favor among academic feminists. As well, I argue an important distinction must be made between what has been written by feminists and what has been canonized in and by academic feminism. Again, I agree with Umansky that much was written on motherhood in the mid-70s to the mid-80s. But did these publications become the key texts in women's studies? Were they included in undergraduate courses or on graduate exam reading lists? My experience and those of the many mother scholars I've spoken to over the years suggest otherwise. Moreover, I contend that the liberal feminist negative stance on motherhood has had a far greater effect on current thinking on motherhood than the celebratory view of mothering present in different cultural feminism. Ask any student of women's studies, and I would venture that they are more likely to regard motherhood as the cause of women's oppression rather than as a site for women's empowerment. Finally, moving 2 decades beyond the time period Umansky looks at, I argue that in the 21st century, not only is motherhood viewed negatively, but it has all but disappeared as a topic in academic feminism. So now I move to the even happier stuff. So I'm now talking about 21st century academic feminism. Samira Kalwash, in a great review article, and I can give you the citation later, she argues that beginning with Riches of Woman Born and until the late 1990s, there was, in her words, a rich feminist tradition of thinking about motherhood that was widely reviewed and recognized as groundbreaking. So she's talking about, the late to mid-90s. And she highlights in particular Umansky's book and Hayes' book. However, she argues that by 2000, the topic of motherhood had drifted to the margins of feminist studies. The leading feminist journal, Science, for example, she notes, published a book review of 2 books on motherhood in 2009. Before that, the last time Science had reviewed a book on motherhood was 1998. So that is 11 years. She goes on to argue that this trickle of attention is in dramatic contrast to the previous decade. In that period, 1995 to in one period alone, 1995 and 1996, Science published 3 review essays on motherhood scholarship, and more than 30 titles were referred to in that review. The sudden appearance of motherhood, she says, though, did not just occur in Science. In 1999, Frontiers published a special issue on motherhood and maternalism. The next time a feminist journal offered a similarly themed issue was the fall-winter of 2009, so 10 years later, when Women's Studies Quarterly did an issue. After searching the Women's Studies International Index for the 2000, she finds a surprising paucity of critical essay studies or book reviews on the topics of mothering and motherhood. In addition, she laments that when she was the director of one PhD program in women and gender studies in the States in the mid-80s, she could not recall receiving one single graduate application that proposed a study on motherhood and mothering. Now, in the spring of this year, Angie DeVoe did some amazing work for me, and we undertook a study of the representation of motherhood in 4 women's studies venues. As I said, panels presented at the annual conference in the National Women's Studies Association between 2010 and 2015, articles and book reviews in 5 feminist journals, the top 5 feminist journals, Science, Frontiers, Women's Studies Quarterly, and Feminist Studies and Gender and Society from 2005 to 2015, the table of contents of 10 introductory gender and women's studies textbooks, and the syllabi of 50 introduction to women's studies courses. So I have always thought this, that we've been ignored, trivialized, and now I have the proof. And I thought I was just being paranoid, but thank you, Angie, for confirming my paranoia. So I'm doing that, and I have a lot more in the book, but I'm just giving you bullets now, quite literally. The breakdown of papers at the National Women's Studies Association, again between 2010 and 2015, are as follows. In 2015, 506 papers were presented with 18 on motherhood. 2014, 593 papers with 29 on motherhood. 2013, 767 with 24 on motherhood. And in 2012, 741 and 10 on motherhood. Overall, 105 papers were presented on motherhood from a total of 3,364 papers, or less than 3%. More popular topics included, oh my gosh, okay, I'm going to skip through this and then I'm going to go to the end. I'll give you the depressing details and then I'll go to my analysis. More popular topics included activism, transnational, race, queer, and so forth. Twice as many papers were published on transnational issues than were on motherhood, and twice as many on race. And combining the topics of trans, queer, and gender studies, more than twice as many papers on gender and sexuality were published than on motherhood. Less than 3%, I would suggest, is far too low, given that motherhood studies is at least established as a field as transnational studies and sexuality studies, yet there was twice as many papers than on these topics. Moreover, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, there has been only one plenary panel in 2006 on mothering. I actually was on that panel on the topic of motherhood at an NWSA conference, and there has never been a motherhood scholar or a motherhood activist as a keynote speaker in the 40 years history of that organization. Similarly low percentages are found in the numbers of articles and book reviews on motherhood in gender and women's studies journals from 206 to 216. The percentage of articles and book reviews on motherhood are as follows, and I'll just do one because of time. Science, only 3% of their articles were on motherhood. Frontiers, 6. Feminist Studies, 1.6. Women's Studies Quarterly, 4. And Gender Studies, 5. And then I do all the comparisons, which I won't do. But interestingly, the average percentage was 3.92 for motherhood, 8.2 for sexuality, and 14.2 for gender. Thus, there was more than twice as many articles on the topic of sex. and close to 4 times as many on gender. The percentage of motherhood content is even lower in Introduction to Gender and Women's Studies textbooks. None of the reviewed 10 books had, between 2010 and 2016, had a section on motherhood. None of the 10. This absence is particularly notable in such textbooks as the recent one, Everyday Women's and Gender Studies, Introductory Concepts. It has no section on motherhood, but it does have a chapter on the manly art of pregnancy. Feminist Frontiers likewise has no section on motherhood, but includes a chapter on masculinities and globalization. 4 of the textbooks did have sections on the family, but only 4 of the approximately 25 chapters in these family sections could be on motherhood. More stats, but basically overall, I estimate there was 150 pages in these books of 5,111 pages, and so the motherhood content is, below 3%. An even lower percent is found in the 50 Introduction to Women's Studies courses of the syllabi examined. Now, 10 of the 50 courses included at least 1 reading on motherhood, so suggesting a percentage of 20%. However, after teasing that through, the perspective of these courses is that of reproductive rights and justice, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but that's not motherhood. One course, for example, included readings on childbirth. Interestingly, 3 of the courses that did have a motherhood reading, they were specifically from a lesbian or black motherhood perspective. Only 1 of the 10 courses had a full unit on motherhood in which motherhood is examined from more than a single perspective and from more than a reproductive rights paradigm. But interestingly, and this is my rant, this unit includes an interview with Rebecca Walker, a feminist writer well known for her mother blame perspective. And anybody who's at 206 NWSA, you know of what I speak. In addition to the 10 courses that have at least 1 reading on motherhood, and there's stuff on family. So overall, and then I'll just end up, I'm not even going to get to my interpretation of why, but I will give a brief. The percentages of motherhood content, women's studies courses, and so forth, journals, range from under 1% to just under 4%. Given that 80% of women become mothers in a lifetime, there is an evident disconnect between the minimal representation of motherhood in academic feminism and the actual lives of most women. Indeed, as Eva Fetter-Kitty emphasizes, most women care for dependents at some point in their lives, and for many women this occupies the better part of their lives. Moreover, these low percentages do not reflect or capture the considerable and significant research done on motherhood over the last 20 years. So I'm just going to give one explanation and then I'll conclude. This is the shortest one. The baby out with the bathwater. Reasons for the exclusion of motherhood in academic feminism. So here I go on my rant about how come you're not talking to mothers, why doesn't mothering count, why are you able to consider other perspectives and include them in your theories and textbooks but not that of mothers, does mothering not count, or so forth. So I will give you one explanation and then I will conclude, and you'll have to buy the book now because actually the good stuff's coming, just the depressing stuff I just said. It is my view, as I said, I think there's 3 reasons. The confusing of motherhood with mothering. Okay, and I will wrap up then. Confusing of motherhood with motherhood, the conflation of motherhood with gender essentialism and post-maternal thinking. But I'm not talking about that now. I will gladly answer those questions. So I'm going to just end with my conclusion, and it is short. I promise, if I can just find it. It's here. Okay. It looks longer than it is. It's because I have to print now in 14 fonts. It's not that long. It actually was only about 20 pages. Okay, motherhood. This is my conclusion, and then I can give my explanations during Q&A if you're interested. This is what Kawash says. Motherhood studies as an area of scholarship is on precarious grounds, ignored by mainstream feminism, fragmented and discontinuous in the academic margins. In making this argument, interestingly, Kawash uses the example of York University's refusal to provide funding for the Association for Research on Mothering. And she's an American and knew about it. And its closure in 2010. This is what she writes. The fact that neither the university system nor the institution of academic feminism appears willing to support a scholarly community and research program that explicitly foregrounds mothering is discouraging, to say the least. However, she goes on to say that the fact that even before York pulled the plug, the established academic community completely ignored the work of ARM. Neither O'Reilly work or that of the Demeter volumes was reviewed in any significant way in any of the leading feminist journals. Thus, while motherhood has been an energizing topic in the past decade, she says, there has been little of boundary crossing movement between academic and popular feminism. and the movement between feminist studies and motherhood studies has only been in one direction. She says this: feminist theory scholars and writers, as well as feminist activists, have a lot to say to each other and a lot to learn from each other about motherhood. Motherhood studies, and I say this with conviction, needs the perspectives and community commitments of feminism, as well as the institutional resources that feminism and women's studies have accumulated over the past 4 decades. At the same time, feminism cannot possibly hope to remain relevant without acknowledging motherhood and all of its contradictions and complexities. Indeed, in the words of Patrice de Quenzio, to the extent that mothering in all its diverse forms remains an important aspect of women's lives and the decision about whether, when, how, and if to be a mother, feminism cannot claim to give an adequate account of women's lives and represent women's interests if it ignores the issues of mothering. In this paper, I was going to say I have discussed, I didn't, but I have discussed the disavowal of motherhood in 20th century feminism and its disappearance in 21st. I've discussed, no I didn't, but there are possible 3 explanations: confusing mother with motherhood, conflation of maternocentric, matricentric feminism with gender essentialism, and conventional thinking. However, and I am concluding, however, despite the disavowal and disappearance of motherhood in academic feminism, we do have a feminist in theory and movement of our own. But matricentric feminism must be more than acknowledged as a legitimate, viable, independent school of feminist thought. It must be integrated into mainstream academic feminism. But how do we accomplish this? We need more women doing motherhood scholarship. Okay? So get your grad students and get them doing the work. We need more mother professors in the academy, particularly positions of influence. We demand that matricentric feminism have a chapter of its own, as do other schools of feminist theory and our feminist theory readers, that introduction to women's studies courses and textbooks include sections on motherhood, that women's studies journals and conferences include more papers on motherhood, and that more books on motherhood are reviewed. We must continuously challenge the conflation of mothering with motherhood within academic feminism, as well as counter the association of matricentric feminism with gender essentialism. And decisively and most urgently, we must interrupt the received narrative of academic feminism, in particular its normalization of the genderless and autonomous subject, in order to foreground the centrality of women's reproductive identities and lives and the importance of care in our larger culture. Indeed, as Anne-Marie Slaughter comments, the bottom line message is that we're never going to get gender equality between men and women until we value the work of care as much as we do value the work of paid work. Valid paid work. That's the unfinished business, she says. Finally, and most importantly, we must demand that matricentric feminists be recognized and respected as the feminists that they are, and that their feminism, that of matricentric feminism, have a room of its own in the larger home of academic feminism. Thank you.